I told him I had lost my spark for him and needed some time apart. He let me go, but replaced me the very next day. Now, I don't even know where to begin. I've made such a mess of everything that it feels impossible to untangle. That's why I'm here, seeking advice, because I can't keep going like this. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, someone who trusted me, gave me his heart, and showed me more grace than I ever earned. And now I'm stuck. The truth is, I didn't just lose my spark for him, I gave it to someone else. I didn't even realize how I was gradually destroying my marriage. It was like I was dancing to a rhythm I couldn't hear until it was too late. If there's anyone who can help me figure out what to do next, I'd be so grateful because I feel like I'm losing my mind. My name is Jane, and I've been married to my husband, Chris, for 8 months. We've been together for 3 years. Chris wasn't ready for marriage when I first brought it up. He wanted to wait until everything in his life was perfect. A stable home, financial security, and a comfortable life for the family he dreamed of. I admired his practicality. Chris grew up without a father, and his childhood was tough. He worked hard to make something of himself, and he was determined to give his future kids the stable life he never had. I respected his vision, but I also felt that we were already stable enough. I had a steady job, and he was earning well. Together, I thought we could build the life we wanted. Eventually, he saw things my way, and we got married. We agreed not to have kids for the first 2 years, so we could focus on creating the ideal life he envisioned. At first, everything felt like a dream. Chris was the perfect husband, thoughtful, supportive, and proud to have me by his side. But over time, cracks began to show. It started with small things. Chris sat me down one day and talked about our spending habits, my spending habits specifically. He wasn't angry, but his tone was serious. He explained that every dollar we saved brought us closer to our goals. I felt blindsided. My friends' husbands never talked about things like this. Why couldn't Chris see that treating myself occasionally wasn't a big deal? That conversation turned into our first fight. It wasn't a screaming match, but it left both of us bruised. Chris tried to explain that he wasn't trying to control me. He just wanted us to stay focused on our future. But all I heard was that I wasn't good enough the way I was. Afterward, I cried not because of what he said, but because I realized how far apart we'd grown. For the first time, I questioned whether we were truly aligned. Chris's practicality, which I had once admired, started to feel suffocating. His well-intentioned advice felt like constant criticism. He would remind me of our financial goals, and I'd feel like he was accusing me of not taking them seriously. Every time he asked me to cut back on spending or rethink my plans, it felt like he was erasing little pieces of who I was. When I planned a girls' trip, Chris hesitated before agreeing to fund it. He brought up the landlord's rent increase and our need for a permanent home. Though he didn't stop me from going, his words stuck with me. I started to see his practicality as controlling, and I framed his concerns as personal attacks. During the trip, I felt free. For the first time in a long while, I laughed, danced, and felt like myself again. But when I came home, the tension between us was undeniable. Chris remained kind and considerate, but I could feel the distance growing. Over time, I withdrew. I stopped attending events with him, made excuses to avoid his family, and even avoided conversations about our future. I felt like the life he envisioned was pulling me further away from the person I wanted to be. Looking back, I see now how much Chris was trying to make things work. But I refused to meet him halfway. Instead, I let resentment and frustration take over. And in that emotional void, I found someone else, someone who made me feel alive and spontaneous again, even if only for a fleeting moment. I never meant for it to happen, but it did. And now, I've destroyed the trust that was the foundation of my marriage. Chris deserves so much better than this. I don't know how to fix what I've broken, or if it's even possible to fix it at all. All I know is that I need help, advice, guidance, anything to figure out what to do next. Because I don't want to lose the man I love, even though I've already pushed him away. I felt like I was failing myself. The more I tried to suppress my feelings, the more they festered. Each day became harder, and I began blaming Chris for the growing chasm between us. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. We went through the motions of daily life, but the weight of unspoken words and unresolved tension hung heavily between us. I kept wondering, was this just a phase? A rough patch that every couple goes through? Or was it something deeper, something neither of us had the energy or will to confront? The uncertainty gnawed at me, and that was the hardest part of all. One day, I tried addressing the situation, but Chris's response remained the same, distant, predictable, and frustrating. It only made me angrier. When I look back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment things started falling apart. We were still trying to work through the tension in our marriage, but amidst the chaos, something else began to stir, something I didn't understand or want to admit. It started small. Our neighbor, Daniel, was young, single, and lived a quiet, steady life. He worked long hours, but was always around when I needed to clear my head. Talking to him about mundane things like the flowers in the compound or the new grocery store downtown became a small escape. Over time, I started noticing him more. Daniel was youthful and charming, and something about him drew me in. Maybe it was the way he always greeted me with a smile, or the way he smelled so fresh, or simply because he was there when Chris and I argued. At first, it felt innocent. If Chris and I had a fight, I'd find myself looking forward to seeing Daniel jog around the compound. We'd talk casually, and he always seemed calm and unbothered. Everything I felt, Chris and I weren't. When I started asking Daniel for rides to work, it felt like a harmless way to clear my head. But those short car rides became something I secretly craved. I told myself it was just friendly conversation, but deep down, I knew better. One morning, I lied to Chris. I told him I had an errand to run before work, but I was really waiting for Daniel. When he pulled up, I got into his car feeling a mix of guilt and excitement. That morning, something reckless and impulsive happened. I made the first move. We ended up making love right there in his car. It was wrong. I knew it. But in that moment, it felt like I had found something I was missing. I promised myself it was a one-time mistake, but it wasn't. It happened again and again. I started avoiding Chris, making excuses to stay behind or sneak away. Chris noticed the changes. I became cold and distant, brushing off his questions and avoiding his touch. He tried to reconnect with me, planning date nights and making small gestures of love. But instead of feeling grateful, I felt suffocated. With Daniel, everything felt simpler. There were no expectations, no obligations. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. But deep down, I knew it wasn't real. It was an escape, a way to feel alive while everything else in my life felt heavy. One evening, during dinner, Chris pressed me about my behavior. I finally blurted out the truth. I had lost my spark for him and needed space. As soon as I said it, I regretted it. I expected Chris to react like the old him, to apologize, to ask how he could change. Instead, he simply said, "Okay," and walked away. That night, I slept on the couch, wrapped in a blanket of anger and frustration, waiting for Chris to apologize. The silence of the house felt heavy, and I told myself that by morning, he'd see reason and come to his senses. He always did. Chris was the kind of man who valued peace over conflict. He'd find a way to bridge the gap, just as he always had. But when I woke up, the couch was cold, and Chris was gone. For a moment, I assumed he had left early for work, as he sometimes did when we argued. But something felt off. The air was still. His usual coffee mug sat untouched on the counter. Pushing the nagging feeling aside, I stepped outside to clear my head, and that's when I saw Daniel waiting in his car again, parked just a few houses down. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I simply walked toward him. The morning was still, the air crisp, but inside, a storm raged. What happened in his car that day was impulsive, selfish, and reckless, a decision driven by anger and a fleeting desire for validation. For a brief moment, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. But as the moments passed, the reality of my actions began to settle like a weight on my chest. Guilt crept in, but I shoved it aside. I wasn't ready to face what I had done. That evening, I returned home, expecting to find things as I'd left them tense but manageable. Instead, I walked into a scene that would forever alter the course of my life. Chris was there, standing in the living room, but he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, someone I vaguely recognized from old photos. He introduced her with unnerving calm, his childhood friend and first love, Emma. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could respond, Chris dropped the real bombshell. He wasn't just reconnecting with Emma, he was leaving. He had already packed the essentials, secured an apartment, and made up his mind. Our marriage was over. It didn't make sense. My mind scrambled to piece it together. Why was he doing this? Why now? Then, he said the words that brought my world crashing down. "I heard you this morning. I stayed home because I wasn't feeling well. I heard everything. Everything. My voice. Daniel's voice. The betrayal." My legs felt weak, and I stumbled toward him, begging for forgiveness. Tears streamed down my face as I clung to his arm, but Chris didn't flinch. His calmness was more devastating than if he'd shouted. He simply asked me to pack my things. "If Daniel's what you want," he said, "then go to him. But I'm done." Desperate, I did just that. I turned to Daniel, hoping he'd offer some kind of salvation. After all, he'd been a part of this too. Surely, he'd understand. But Daniel's reaction was as cold as the betrayal I'd inflicted on Chris. "You threw yourself at me," he said, his voice sharp and dismissive. "It was just a fling, nothing more." In that moment, the gravity of my choices hit me like a tidal wave. I had destroyed everything: my marriage, my stability, my future, with one selfish, impulsive decision. And now, I was left with nothing. The days that followed were a blur of anguish. I tried to reach Chris, pleading with him to reconsider. I promised to change, to fix the cracks I'd created. But Chris was resolute. "Some wounds don't heal," he said one day when I showed up at his new apartment uninvited. "And some choices can't be undone." He was right, of course. The signs had been there for months, but I had been too blind to see them. I resented Chris for his practicality, for his concerns over my spending, for the way he always seemed to play it safe. I convinced myself that I wanted excitement, freedom. But now, standing in the wreckage of my life, those grievances seemed trivial, petty even. Chris had been my anchor, the person who loved me unconditionally, and I had thrown it all away for nothing. As the weeks turned into months, the pain only deepened. I heard through mutual friends that Chris had started dating again. The news stung, but I told myself it was a rebound, a way for him to cope with the pain I had caused. But then, only a few months after our divorce was finalized, I learned that Chris had remarried. The speed of it was shocking, but it was the finality of it that broke me. He had moved on, built a new life, and I was no longer a part of it. I tried to rationalize my pain, to tell myself that I wasn't entirely to blame. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had been selfish. I had made the choices that led to this, and now I was left to deal with the consequences. The fallout extended beyond my marriage. Friends began to distance themselves, their loyalty lying with Chris. Husbands, wary of associating with someone branded a cheat, subtly encouraged their wives to cut ties with me. My social circle evaporated, leaving me isolated in a world of regret. I replayed the memories of our life together endlessly, tormenting myself with thoughts of what could have been. The way Chris used to bring me coffee in bed on lazy Sunday mornings. The way he'd listen patiently when I vented about work, even when I didn't acknowledge how tired he was. The dreams we once shared of building a life together, a family, a home filled with love and laughter. All of it was gone now, shattered by my own hand. When I saw a photo of Chris and his new wife on social media, smiling and carefree, it felt like a dagger to the heart. He looked happy, truly happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. I wanted to hate her, to resent the life they were building together, but deep down, I knew she wasn't the problem. I was. Every day since the divorce has been a struggle. The weight of my mistakes is a constant companion, a shadow that follows me everywhere. I've tried to move forward, but the pain of knowing I destroyed the one thing that truly mattered is suffocating. Chris was my everything, and I was too blind to see it until it was too late. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Love is fragile. It requires care, patience, and selflessness. I thought our vows, for better or worse, meant we'd fight for each other no matter what. But I crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now I'm living with the consequences. I don't expect sympathy. I don't deserve it. But I needed to say this, to confront the reality of what I've lost. Some mistakes can never be undone, and the pain of causing your own heartbreak is the worst of all. For now, I'm trying to pick up the pieces of my life. It's a slow, painful process, but it's all I can do. I don't know what the future holds, but one thing is certain. I'll carry the weight of this regret with me for the rest of my life. And maybe in time, that burden will teach me to be better, to love better, to never take for granted the things that truly matter.